Hi there, and welcome to Lecture 2 of Unit 4. Unit 4 is Industrialization. In Lecture 2, today we're going to focus on the Industrialists and their contribution to the industrialization era, as well as the United States government philosophy and how they impacted industrialization, the government and its approach to business and the economy. The industrialists can be looked at one of two ways, and both of them are correct. It just matters, maybe what your dealings with them were. On one hand, they were known as robber barons who stole from the public, exploited workers, drained resources, and so forth. There was no doubt that these men here that are pictured, John Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, as well as many others that made millions and millions during this era, did so at the expense of the workers and the lower class. They were ruthless businessmen who used, cutthroat competition and were strike breakers and all of these things. But keep in mind that they did not break any laws because the government sided with them in these labor disputes, and there were no laws protecting workers at this time. On the other hand, some people saw the industrialists as captains of industry who created new markets, expanded the economy, benefited the American economy, pushed industrialization, embodied the American dream, and all of these characteristics are true as well. So both of these names have a great deal of truth to them. It just kind of depends on what your relationship with these men were and how you saw them. If you were a worker, you probably didn't really care for the industrialists, as they were making their riches by taking advantage of you. If you were a business associate or you benefited positively in your dealings with the industrialists, then you probably had a little bit better you thought of them more positively.
Taking care of business every day. Taking care of business every way. We've been taking care of business.
Today we're going to look at a few industrialists of this era that left their mark and what they were known for. Andrew Carnegie was a Scottish immigrant who came over with very little, and he started at the bottom. He is definitely an industrialist who lived the American dream. And so he came over and he was involved in the steel industry. He first worked in a mine, and eventually he used vertical consolidation to establish a monopoly in the steel industry. Now, vertical consolidation or vertical integration is when you control every phase of the production of a product. And so as time went on, he owned mines, he bought a railroad, he owned the processing plants, the smelters. So he owned everything that was necessary to produce steel, which allowed him to cut out the middlemen and lower his prices. Also, he had very good quality control of the steel. He saw every phase of how it was being produced, so it could be done just exactly the way that he wanted it to. And so as a result of this, Andrew Carnegie established a monopoly in the steel industry. Now, one other thing about Carnegie, he ended up giving away over $350 million in his lifetime for the creation of public libraries and universities and so forth. And he was famous for a writing of his called The Gospel of Wealth, in which he stated it was duty of the rich to give back to society, not necessarily handouts to poor. He treated his workers horribly. During the Homestead strike, he did everything possible to stop the strike and fire the workers that went on strike. But on the other hand, he was also very generous, and he gave away a considerable amount of money for public good. Now, this is an excerpt from the Gospel of Wealth. It says, "This then is held to be the duty of the man of wealth, first to set an example of modest, unostentatious living, shunning display, to provide moderately for the legitimate wants of those dependent upon him, and after doing so, to consider all surplus revenues which come to him simply as trust funds, which he is strictly bound, as a matter of duty, to administer in the manner which, in his judgment, is best calculated to produce the most beneficial results of the community." And he practiced what he preached. Like I stated before, he gave away over $350 million. Carnegie Hall, Carnegie Mellon University, many libraries were funded by Andrew Carnegie. John Rockefeller was another leading industrialist of this era, and he used horizontal consolidation and trusts to create a monopoly in the oil industry. His company was Standard Oil. Now, what a trust is, we'll get to in a little bit, was what he did. Rockefeller organized his competitors, and they formed a group, a board of directors, and they would buy their supplies together to cut down on their expenses. But the biggest thing they did through these trusts was eliminate competition amongst themselves, and competition is what drives prices down. So by using horizontal consolidation and forming trusts, he gained control of other oil companies, and he ended up establishing a monopoly in the oil industry, which would lead him to becoming probably the richest American in the history of this country, worth more than anyone else. Cornelius Vanderbilt was one of the many railroad tycoons. He was probably the most successful of the railroad tycoons. Railroads were a big business. There weren't all that many of them. And if you had a monopoly in the railroad industry, great fortunes could be made there as well. Obviously, Vanderbilt University became known, or was named after Cornelius Vanderbilt. J.P. Morgan was a financier and a banker who financed a lot of these conglomerates, a lot of these corporations coming together as one. He provided the finances for many of these corporations that were expanding, and as a result, he was one of the most powerful men in America during industrialization. Now, this is an interesting slide. These figures they've all been equated to $2,007. And so you can see the net worth of some of the richest men in the history of America. So Rockefeller was worth over $180 billion. Carnegie, right at $100 billion. Vanderbilt, a little bit less. And then you come to Bill Gates, who's only at $60 billion. J.P. Morgan, who we talked about, Jay Gould and James Hill, who were also involved in the railroads. So you see all of these but Gates are from the time period of industrialization, 1865 to 1900, when they made their fortunes. And the reason why they were able to make much more than Bill Gates today or Warren Buffett is because there were no government restrictions during the era in which they operated business. You'll see as we go through the next couple slides, the government supported industrialists, and it was much easier to make a great deal of money back then than it is today. So this is a main reason why the industrialists were as successful as they were. Laissez-faire is a philosophy that states that government should not be involved in business or the economy. No government intervention. So if you take a look at all the ways that the government is involved in business today, everywhere from minimum wage to no child labor to safety measures being taken at work, all these things employers have to provide today, and those things are all costly. Industrialists during the era of industrialization didn't have to worry about any of those things. They could make their workers work 60 hours a week, 80 hours a week. They could pay them 25 cents an hour or less. Okay, they could have children working. Over 50% of the nation's workers that worked in factories and mines at this time were less than 10 years old. Okay. How did they justify it? Well, they kind of used a scientific theory, survival of the fittest, social Darwinism. They said in business, just as in life, there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers. The winners are going to make it rich, they're going to become the upper class, and the losers are going to be poor. And that's just the way that society was working. However, there were some problems that resulted from laissez-faire, many problems. The establishment of monopolies. Like I told you, Carnegie had a monopoly in the steel industry, Rockefeller in the oil industry, Vanderbilt and the other railroad tycoons had some monopolies, and so the consumers were forced to pay extremely high prices. Small businesses were forced out of business, as we'll see. Trusts were created by Rockefeller, again, with the same net result as allowing monopolies to be created in certain industries. And so the result of all these things were they were harmful to the consumer. Obviously, it's much better for the consumer if there's a great competition going on for goods, providing goods or services. That drives the prices down. So if you only have one producer, then other businesses are going to be forced out. There's going to be less competition. Prices are going to be much higher, and the rich are going to get richer at the expense of the poor. And this was obviously the case of what happened during the era of industrialization. And that will conclude Lecture 2 of Unit 4. Lecture 2 of Unit 4. Thank you.